Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome once again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville politics, government, business, education, whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. Joined, as always, on this frankly sort of sleepy Friday morning, for me anyway, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
Probably better than you. You had to get up early and go out and do something that no one should have to endure. I know we're going to be talking about that in just a minute.
That's right. It was not a colonoscopy. Let me be clear.
But I was able to sleep in, so I'm okay.
Glad to hear it. Glad somebody in this room got some sleep. It's been a busy week. Of course, we had the primary elections on Tuesday. But there was a lot of other stuff going on this week, too. We had meetings of city council and the planning commission, a special called meeting of county commission. The school board was in action. We're going to talk to some degree about all of those things. And we will be joined later in the podcast by our friend Mike Cohen to do some sort of election analysis deep dives. But, Scott, we should probably start out right at the top here by talking a bit about the elections. If people have not been paying attention or tuned in, we did have primary elections here in Knox County this past week, and there were some interesting results. I guess to run through them really quickly, there were two. First of all, as we've talked about here in previous weeks, all the action in the primary was on the Republican side. There was only one competitive Democratic primary. That was in the 1st District for County Commission, and that was Damon Rawls won that against Evelyn Gill. And then everything else was Republicans. So countywide, we had two Republican primaries. There was the property assessor's race and the law director's race. Law director, incumbent David Book, pretty easily winning that primary against challenger Daniel Herrera. Scott, any surprise about that? I think Book got close to 70% of the vote, more than 2/3 of the vote.
Maybe a little bit the margin because Herrera was former Republican Party chair, raised a lot of money. Although Book closed the gap there toward the end, but I'm not surprised at the outcome. A little bit surprised at the margin. Mm-hmm. I was thinking maybe 60% and would be his Book's ceiling on that, but yeah, he got close to 70%. He really trounced Herrera. Herrera, is he's obviously well known among people who are active in the Republican Party, but then again, most voters aren't active in party goings on, so probably a little less well known among the rank and file voters. Then Book has been around for such a long time. He's been practicing law for 40-something years, so he's he's got a lot of experience, a lot of name recognition there. So.
Yeah, and I do think that there were various sort of narratives and themes you could take from the election results. I don't feel like there was any one overarching narrative. But one thing you can definitely see in it is that incumbents did well. There were not a ton of incumbents on the ballot. You had Book in that race, and then County Commission Chair Terry Hill facing a primary challenge in the 6th District, which she won very easily against Julie McBee Fritz. And I think in the other countywide race, the property assessor's race, that even though there was not an incumbent running, Phil Ballard, who ended up winning that primary by 12 votes out of more than 42,000 votes cast in that race, he is a former property assessor, and I think you have to assume that name recognition, because in a property assessor's race, we talked about this in previous weeks, there's not a lot of ways for candidates to differentiate themselves because it's such a technical services office essentially. And so really all you can kind of run on is your experience or qualifications. Phil Ballard has served 2 previous terms as property assessor. And so you have a lot of people in the county who are accustomed to seeing his name on the ballot. And Jackie Raley, who has been the chief deputy to current assessor John Whitehead, she ran a very well-funded race. She had a lot of support from people in the assessor's office right now, including John Whitehead, and also people in the Republican Party. She had a very visible campaign from, starting almost a year ago at this point. And Ballard early on kind of looked like he was going to be out fundraised and just kind of, maybe he was going to be yesterday's news. But when it came down to it, I think the fact, and that is an office that a lot of people don't necessarily think about until they get to the voting booth.
Yes.
And so I think that his name recognition, even though he wasn't an incumbent, I think he had some of the advantages of an incumbent. And of course,
well, one of the things he did was his campaign signs all said re-elect Phil Ballard.
Yeah.
So, which
Jackie Raley complained about but she was kind of told, well, he wasn't violating anything. Technically, what he was saying was correct. He has been elected in the past, so he was asking for you to re-elect him. But certainly, it may have created the impression to people that he was the incumbent. But so speaking of that race, you mentioned the thing.
I want to interrupt on that real quick because one
ahead.
of the things that I was in watching that race that I thought was interesting is that he was running on how bad a job the assessment was the couple of years ago, how long it took, how stuff like that. And so like the dichotomy of those two things together, it's like I'm kind of pretending like I'm the incumbent, but I'm also telling you how bad the incumbent did.
Right. Sort of like having the advantages of incumbency and the advantages of being an outsider who's going to come in and fix things at the same time. Something that we are also seeing, I think, a little bit in the presidential race this year, which we're not going to talk about, but I do think that that's it's if you can have the name recognition and basis of support and everything that comes with being an incumbent, but also position yourself as the reformer who's going to come in and fix whatever people are unhappy about, that's a pretty potent position to be in. So, Scott, you mentioned the thing I had to get up early to do this morning, and what that was that race was so close. 12 votes out of those 42,000 cast, and there were 71 provisional ballots across Knox County on Tuesday, and provisional ballots are basically ballots that haven't yet been counted because they have to verify that the person is registered and also has not otherwise voted. Sometimes these are people whose registration information is wrong. Chris Davis, the election administrator, said that the biggest thing they see these days is people who maybe wait to the last minute to ask for an absentee ballot, and then it either doesn't come in time or they don't send it in time, or it comes and they send it in, but they're afraid that it's not going to get there because they don't. Absentee ballots in Tennessee, unlike some other states, are not counted if they arrive after Election Day. And so one thing that people in that situation can do is they can go and cast a ballot on Election Day, and it's a provisional ballot because what the Election Commission has to do then is verify that, okay, their absentee ballot did not get counted because obviously you can't have anybody voting twice. So every election cycle, they have a process where they go through and review all the provisional ballots and verify which ones can count and then count them. And usually that's not something we pay a lot of attention to. I've never been to a provisional ballot count before this morning, but they held that count at 9 o'clock Friday out at the Farragut office, the West office of the Election Commission. And because there were 71 provisional ballots and there was only a 12-vote difference between those two assessor candidates, it was mathematically possible for there to be enough legitimate ballots for Jackie Raley to change the outcome of the election. However, that's not what happened. And Chris Davis had said before the count that typically about half of provisional ballots end up counting, and that was in fact the case. So they had 71 provisional ballots. 38 of them were legitimate ballots cast by people who were properly registered and had not otherwise submitted a ballot. So they counted 38 of them. 7 of those were people who had pulled Democratic ballots. And so those had no way of affecting the assessor's race because it was Republican primary. So then you were down to 31 ballots that theoretically could affect the assessor's race. 5 of those ballots, people didn't vote for the assessor at all. And that was something that happened countywide. There were about 4,500 or so people who voted in the Republican primary who didn't vote for the property assessor. So you think about that. This is a 12-vote margin. There's 4,500 people who went to the trouble to vote and got a Republican ballot and just got to that one and were like, you know what? I don't have an opinion about this. So those 5 got thrown at, or those 5 couldn't affect that race. They were counted for whatever other races they voted in. And so that left 26. And of those 26, Raley and Ballard split them exactly evenly. It was right in line with the rest of the votes. This was essentially a 50-50 election, and that's how the provisional ballots broke for them. They each gained 13 votes, which meant that it didn't affect that 12-vote margin at all. Phil Ballard has been reelected as county property assessor. I'm sure a huge disappointment to Raley, who ran a long and hard and very visible and prominent campaign. And we will have more coverage of that, including some of Phil Ballard's plans, assuming he wins the general election, because he does have an opponent, a Democratic opponent in August, and we will be writing about that race and both of those candidates ahead of that election. But Scott, I think this was interesting for 2 reasons. One, just that it was so close.
Yes.
And 2, that it was in the property assessor's race, which is just a race that, again, a lot of people, 4,500 people, almost 10% of the Republican turnout just said, nah, we're not even going to vote in that race. And
everybody else just flipped a coin.
Right.
It was 50-50. So.
So it was an interesting thing to watch, but the net result of that, again, if Ballard wins the general election, which he would be favored in because it's a countywide race, the county overall votes more Republican than Democrat, but it would continue this streak. So Ballard and John Whitehead have been trading the property assessor's office back and forth literally all century at this point.
Really?
We've gone Whitehead to Ballard to Whitehead, and it looks like we're going back to Ballard. So some things change, but some things don't.
Yeah, and it's interesting, those processes that they go through. I remember 2 decades ago, there was a voting machine that short-circuited, and they couldn't count the votes out of it. And there was a referendum question about. I mean, it would have affected any of the races, except they had a referendum question about a sheriff's pension, the sheriff's office pension, and mathematically could have affected the outcome. And they took the machine under police escort to a company out on Middlebrook Pike. and they brought in. I mean, there must have been 15, 20 people there observing. There were election commission members, Republican Party representatives, Democratic Party representatives, people from the sheriff's office. Everybody was in there to watch, and they actually had a technician go in and fix the machine, while being observed the entire time, and including by the media. I was there, and they were able to restore it and then count the votes and everything. But that whole process of them bringing in, because they have to be open about all this, and I'm sure they were in Farragut. This morning.
Very much. I mean, this all happened right out in the open. There were 2 tables of volunteers who serve on their provisional ballot board, and that's a bipartisan group. They're made up of equal parts Democrats and Republicans. They were also all senior citizens, I think it's safe to say, which is something I think we see a lot of in terms of people who are really involved in electoral politics. A lot of our poll workers are older folks. A lot of the folks who are involved in organizations like League of Women Voters are older folks. So, and I'm not quite in that age demographic yet myself, although it's on the not too distant horizon. But I just want to say, big shout out to anybody over 65 out there who's spending their golden years volunteering for this kind of often very tedious but very necessary to the functioning of our democracy work. And yeah, it was right out in the open. They had 2 tables set up, and there was a group of observers there. Both Raley and Ballard were there with a few of their supporters, and then members of the media were there. The TV cameras were just kind of walking around the tables, filming everything. It was all completely open. And, I know that kind of transparency and accountability is something that I think our election commission and Chris Davis, the administrator, takes seriously. I think they took it seriously even before 2020, but after all the, of course, mostly nonsensical talk in 2020 about stolen elections and ballots and everything, I think everybody who works in election commissions around the country now feels sort of an extra need to be as transparent as possible, and they certainly were. Looking real quickly at the other races, county commission and the first district we mentioned, Damon Rawls won the Democratic primary. Charles Frazier won the Republican primary. It was interesting that there was a Republican primary there because it's such a Democratic district. Sometimes there's not even a Republican candidate, much less 2 of them. Charles Frazier just barely beat Justin Hurst in that Republican primary by 5 votes. And that was another one that could have been changed by the provisional ballots because there were 5 provisional ballots in that race. So if all 5 of those ballots had been legitimate and been cast in the Republican primary and been cast for Hurst, Hurst theoretically could have tied.
Yeah.
But at least 1 and maybe more of those ballots were Democratic ballots. And so that meant that right off the bat, there was no way that could change. However, going into the general election, obviously it's such a heavily Democratic district. Damon Rawls would appear to have a pretty big advantage there. In the 4th district Republican primary, Garrett Holt defeated Liz Tombras. That was a race where, as we've talked about, Liz Tombras's biggest kind of campaign point against Holt was just that he's not a real Republican, that he's not conservative enough. There was even an effort to kick him off the ballot, which failed, and he won actually quite handily. He had raised a lot more money, had a much broader base of support going into the primary than Tombras, but he's going to face a tough race in August against Shane Jackson. The 4th district is our most purple, most politically mixed district in the county. In the 5th district, that one was interesting because, as we talked about here before, it was a 5-candidate field in the Republican primary. And so, I think on this very podcast, I quipped that it would be possible for somebody to win that with, no more than 22% of the vote or something. But in fact, one of those 5, Angela Russell, who kind of ran with a lot of support from homeowners associations, and she was also part of conservative consultant Eric Wyatt's sort of quasi-slate of more far-right candidates. I don't know. They call themselves the conservative Republicans or constitutional Republicans. But in any case, she won 48% of the vote in a 5-person race.
That's pretty impressive.
That's really impressive.
I don't know that I've ever seen anyone who's not an incumbent win a multi-candidate race with that high of a vote.
Yeah, and not just not an incumbent, but not real high name recognition before. Yeah. I mean, I think, she's active in her neighborhood association, and she was part of the group that got organized to fight against the proposed affordable housing complex there in Choteau last year, which I think was kind of her introduction to real that level of civic involvement. But certainly not somebody who I think most people in the 5th District had ever heard of before the campaign. And she was running against people who had some substantial support. Brad Hall's a captain in the sheriff's office. I mean, he certainly has, there are people in the community who know him. Tony Scott had a lot of support from kind of, certain members of the Republican establishment and so forth. So it wasn't just that she was a well-known candidate who beat a field of nobodies. She was not a very well-known candidate, and she beat a field of people who were at least as well-known as she was. And so, I think one thing that we have seen with Eric Wyatter and his candidates is he's very strategic and targeted about the voters he goes after, and he also makes sure that his candidates get out there and work and show up in the community. They don't tend to show up at forums and things like that. Angela Russell did not turn out to the candidate forum that we had. But they do show up doing the door knocking, and some of the appeal of Wyatter's candidates may be ideological, but some of it is probably also just that they do the work, and we talk about that a little bit with Mike Cohen in the segment that's coming up. Continuing on our tour in the 6th District, as we mentioned, Terry Hill easily winning the primary there. She does have a Democratic opponent. Daniel Green. I should also mention in the 5th District, Angela Russell will be facing Democrat Arthur Moore in the general election. But, Terry Hill, again, the advantages of incumbency, and she's both the county commission incumbent and also previously was elected twice to the school board in that district. So this is actually the 4th election that she is running in the 6th District. She's a very well-known and well-connected candidate, and certainly appears to be in pretty strong shape heading into the general. The 8th District was really interesting. You had 3 Republicans there, Cara Daly, DJ Corcoran, and Adam Thompson. And one of the interesting factors was that you had 2 sort of well-established political operations going against each other there. DJ Corcoran, first of all, was well-known to those of us in the media and to a lot of people across the city from his years with the Knoxville Fire Department. And he is also the brother of Sherry Witt, who's the county clerk, and she has and previously she served as Register of Deeds. She has a lot of experience in running and winning county races, and certainly I'm sure that helped Corcoran. And Adam Thompson had the support of Steve Hunley and the Knoxville Focus. And Hunley has, for years now, been a real power broker in that district in particular. That's kind of Hunley's home base. It's where he's from. It's where I think he cares about the most. And it has been true for some time now that people have not gotten elected to office in the 8th District if Hunley is backing somebody else. There have been some candidates who have won without Hunley's explicit endorsement, but they haven't won against another candidate who has Hunley's endorsement. And so Adam Thompson had that. It was interesting watching those returns come. And then Cara Daly was, she was the youngest candidate in that race, one of the youngest candidates on the ballot. She owns a couple of popular diners out there in that district and is, well known in the community, but not as established as either of the other 2. And she got about 20% of the vote. And then Corcoran and Thompson were very close with the rest of it. And all night, as the returns were coming in, Corcoran was actually up a little bit for much of the evening. And then on the last batch of votes that showed up, it flipped it, and Thompson ended up winning, so it maintained Hundley's streak out there. And Thompson probably not a super different candidate from Corcoran in terms of the kinds of things they'll support, except that he has been very vocal and skeptical about the county's growth plan. He's been one of the spokespeople for a group of planning advocates out in Gibbs, and basically people who are very concerned that as that area grows and develops, that they're able to protect existing farms and farmland and preserve some of the rural character of the 8th District. And so I think he was one of the candidates, and Angela Russell is another one, because in that 5th District, a lot of those homeowners associations tend to be very skeptical of new growth and development. So I think you're looking at the possibility of adding a couple of new commissioners to commission who are going to be more on the side of being cautious and skeptical about growth and development, not anti, as they all say. We're not anti-development. We want good development or smart development or whatever the ways people couch it. But still, those were two candidates whose opponents received, significant donations from developers. And now those developers are going to have to try to make nice and find support on the new commission. Assuming that both Russell and Thompson, because they both do have Democratic opponents in August, assuming that they win their general elections, but both of those districts are very Republican, and so they are the strong favorites for sure. The 9th District County Commission race, again, very interesting. Andy Fox, ideological firebrand attorney, handily winning the Republican primary. He was another Eric Wyatter candidate. Pretty good night for Eric Wyatt.
Yeah, it was.
He won like 70% of the vote against Barry Neal, who was a more conventional, sort of normal county commission candidate in the sense that he came up through his...
You're not saying that Andy Fox is abnormal, are you?
He's an unusual figure, let's say. I don't want to say he's abnormal, but he's Andy Fox is a very strong personality. He has a lot of very strong, very right-wing political ideas about things. I mean, he said explicitly one of his big goals is that he wants to make sure that South Knox County doesn't get any more liberal than it already is. He's very afraid of creeping liberalism emanating out of the city through the South Knoxville districts and kind of, poisoning the whole district from his point of view. So if he wins in August, I think we can expect to see a more combative, more ideological county commissioner there than really we've seen on county commission, period, in recent years. I mean, there are a couple of other commissioners who somewhat lean in that direction, but I think you would anticipate Fox being he would be a very fiery presence in a lot of ways. But he does have a general election opponent. In fact, two of them. There's Democrat Matthew Park running there and an independent candidate named Stacey Smith. And that district, although it has been represented by Republicans for as long as I know, it has been trending a little bit more. I'm not going to say it's a purple district yet, but Democrats have certainly made some inroads, especially in the parts of that district that are within the city. In South Knoxville, most of those precincts have now turned to reliably Democratic strongholds, and those are also where South Knoxville is experiencing a lot of growth. Matthew Park probably will look to turn out as much of that new base as he can. And then you do have a third candidate there, Stacey Smith, who's running as an independent, but initially pulled a petition also as a Republican. And so it's also possible, if there are Republicans who aren't completely comfortable with Fox's views on things, there's a third candidate there that could absorb some of that. So that race could be interesting. We'll certainly be talking about it a lot ahead of August. There were two school board races that had primaries. The 3rd District, both of these were Republican primaries. Angie Goddard won fairly handily. I mean, it ended up being a somewhat close race between her and Robert Daspit in the 3rd District. And of course, she's the one who had been the former co-founder of the local chapter of Moms for Liberty, the conservative activist group, but then had sort of distanced herself from them, and Moms for Liberty endorsed Daspit, her opponent, while Goddard had support from more kind of mainstream establishment Republicans, and she was able to get through there. She faces a Democrat, Patricia Fontenot Ridley, in the general. And again, the 3rd district is there was a very close county commission primary there, county commission election there just 2 years ago, where Gina Oster won a fairly narrow margin over Democrat Stuart Hall. So, that race will be interesting to watch. Then the 8th district school board primary, this was the only race on the ballot that was going to be decided in the primary because there's no Democrat or independent candidate running in the general election. And Travis Wright, by a fairly decent margin, defeated Tommy Lakins. Travis Wright also had the support of Steve Hunley and the Knoxville Focus, as well as members of the Haslam family. And that was interesting because we've had plenty of elections, including school board races, where sort of the Haslam contingent and the Hunley contingent have been backing different horses. But in this race, they were on the same horse, and he won fairly easily, and his family's very well known in the district. When I talked to Wright after the election, he said that he thought that was the biggest thing, was just people know his family, they know his folks,
Yep.
They trust them. His uncle Dave Wright is the current state representative for that area, and in the 8th district in particular, I think that's an area where that kind of thing still matters. Adam Thompson, very similar situation in the 8th district. He's the 6th generation running a family farm out there. And if there's any place in Knox County that those kind of deep family roots really still resonate, it's certainly in the 8th district. And of course, the one thing that happened with Travis Wright after winning that school board primary was the next morning, Wednesday morning, he was promptly sworn into office because incumbent Mike McMillan had died a month ago, and county commission had decided to just wait for the primary and go ahead and appoint whoever won the primary to serve out the last 6 months of Mike McMillan's term. And so Travis Wright went from being a candidate Tuesday night to being sworn into office Wednesday morning, and he was sitting in his seat at the school board meeting Thursday night. So it was, as he said,
pretty quick.
Yeah, he said it was a bit of a whirlwind. But Scott, anything here interesting to you about turnout? I felt like turnout was about 60,000 people total. It's down about 20-25% from the same cycle in 2020, but we kind of expected that, right?
Yeah, we did. One of the things is, of course, every 4 years, primary turnout is driven by the presidential race, especially on the Democratic side. President Biden was unopposed. So you can see in the number of Democrats who turned out and the number of Republicans who turned out, Republicans in much greater numbers than the traditional split is when there's a Republican versus a Democrat. And,
right.
So that kind of stood out as something there. The Democrats just didn't go to the polls as much. There may have been some who crossed over and voted in the Republican primary. A lot that happens a lot. No way to track that, but it does happen. And I thought that the interesting dynamic there with Herrera losing to Book, and then Fox winning in the 9th district. It's kind of interesting because they're both kind of on the same page ideologically,
and they were both part of that slate that was endorsed by the Knox County conservative Republicans,
right?
Yeah.
And but it's interesting that their outcomes were so. Complete opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the law director's office that vote is countywide. the district is just in South Knox County, but still, that dichotomy there was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think it does, and of course we get into this in our segment coming up with Mike, but I think it just does illustrate that regardless of other factors, or not regardless of, but a factor that matters a lot in addition to all the other factors is just how good the candidate is. Yeah. How good are they? First of all, what's their background? What's their experience in the Buch-Herrera race? There's just a vast difference in experience. Buch had been a lawyer for 44 years and Herrera for 4 years.
Yeah.
And Buch has been working in that office for the last 12 years because he spent 8 years in it as chief deputy before becoming law director. And so, experience does actually matter. Name recognition matters. Door knocking matters. Showing up at events matters. All of this kind of politics 101 stuff is still very important. Other things come into play for sure, but that can be why it's hard sometimes to compare different races, because there's always just the X factor of, well, who's the actual candidate?
Right.
And I think we saw a fair amount of that play out on Tuesday. All right. Well, for those of you who want still more election talk, just hang around, because coming up in a few minutes, we have a conversation, as we said, with Mike Cohen about that. But there were some other things that happened this week, too, that we somehow managed to pay attention to in the midst of all of this. Scott, City Council met, and you wrote about an interesting project that was on the agenda there, which is the renovation of the historic Sanitary Laundry building on Broadway.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Sanitary Laundry building was a commercial dry cleaning operation. It started in 1925, so the building is 99 years old. Was in operation until 93, and it's been basically empty ever since. It's a dry cleaning business, so there are a lot of solvents and chemicals and stuff. It's just an environmental nightmare in there. And the city bought it, or didn't buy it. They took it in a tax, delinquent tax.
Yeah, I think reluctantly ended up in possession of it.
Nobody wanted the building. Even the people who owned it didn't pay taxes on it because they wanted the city to take it too, I guess. But anyway, the city got it. They got a federal grant, did some remediation work, but it's been one of those buildings. It's a kind of a neat looking 2-story brick building right near the intersection of Central and Broadway, and near Emory Place, near Old Gray Cemetery. People who are familiar with that area will know exactly where it is. But the city kind of wanted to get somebody to do something with it. Well, enter McCarty, Wholesale McCarty, the prominent architecture firm. They've been around for almost 60 years, and they have designed a lot of the public buildings that we see, the City County building, the Art and Architecture building at UT. They've also done a lot of historic renovation work too, historic preservation work, like the Big Tennessee Theater renovations a few years ago. So they are going to be buying it essentially for a new headquarters. And what City Council had to do is, first of all, they had to transfer the ownership from the city of Knoxville to KCDC, Knoxville's Community Development Corporation. So it could be a couple of reasons. First of all, they can do redevelopment incentives if KCDC controls it, and then also they qualify for a state grant, a $500,000 state grant that they can use to further clean up the site. But McCarty, Wholesale McCarty is going to take about half the space. It's a 30,000 square foot building, pretty good sized building. About half of it's going to be their headquarters. The other half they're going to have tenants. They want to, then it's going to be kind of some shared workspace there. They're hoping to get creatives to come in there. So, so they're going to have they're going to be move their entire operation there, which is a really high profile business for that area of Knoxville, which is kind of growing again. It's right around the corner from Axle Logistics. They renovated a historic building there for their headquarters. They're building a second building there for their growing workforce, and there are a lot of other new businesses in that area too.
Yeehaw Brewing's right there. Emery Place is just a block away. That whole nexus is kind of, in a way, it's returning to its historic origins, because it used to be a very busy commercial corridor through there, which is why we have all these historic buildings there. But a lot of those buildings have been sitting in sort of various states of disuse for some years.
Yeah, and they're hoping to be able to start moving forward pretty quickly on that. One of the things that will probably end up happening is they'll probably seek a payment in lieu of tax agreement or pilot to help finance this. So that'll have to come to City Council for approval of that, but they can do that because it's in a redevelopment area, and KCDC technically owns the property now. So, but those details are the first thing they had to do. They had to do was get the property in KCDC's name, and that's what council did on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. Well, good news on the preservation front for sure. And
absolutely.
That is a really nice building. And, if you've driven that part of Broadway, you're probably familiar with it, but it'll be nice to see it.
Yeah. On the second story, had these big arched windows. They're bricked in now, but one of the things that, of course, McCarty has some renderings of what they think it'll look like. They're conceptual. They're not, things could change, but they're really going to open it up. Be a lot of glass. They also had these big bays for trucks to go into that are bricked over, and they're going to be they're going to open all those up. Lots of windows, lots of natural light in the workspace. So it'll be as Nathan Honeycutt, who is principal at McCarty Wholesale McCarty, told me, it's going to be a historic building with kind of a blend of this more contemporary, airy feel to it. So.
Right, which is really what McCarty Holzapfel is known for in the not the historic preservation necessarily, but the buildings they're known for building. They were the primary progenitors of modernism in Knoxville.
Yeah.
And so I guess bringing a little bit of that modernist to bear on the historic facade.
Yeah. But one of the things that Honeycutt was wanted to make sure when I talked to him about this, make sure I understood, that they've done a lot of historic preservation too.
Yeah.
They're not just a modernist firm or contemporary firm. They do both, and that's what they're shooting for in this, is kind of a blend of those two aspects of architecture.
Right. Well, if you're driving through there in the next year or so and you see things happening, that's what's happening. I wanted to talk briefly about the school board. As I mentioned, the big news for the board this week was they got a new member with Travis Wright now representing the 8th District. They also had some interesting presentations at their work session on Monday, and going to be writing a little bit more about some of those next week. But one that stood out because of its potential budgetary impact is they got a report from consultants who they hired to do a compensation salary study. And what it came back saying is that Knox County teachers and staff, not only teachers, but basically their salary ranges are about 8 to 9% below market. And by market, what they mean is they looked at 20 comparison school systems, including some right around us here in East Tennessee, other large systems across Tennessee, Hamilton County, Davidson County, Shelby County, Rutherford County, etc. And then they also looked at 10 school systems of similar size in other surrounding states, really trying to get a feel for, teachers who live in this area who are looking for work. How does Knox County stack up? And what they found was that their salary ranges are a little bit low, which is probably not news to people who work for Knox County schools because that's something they've been saying for a long time. But of course, everybody always says that. Yeah. And the study pretty much verified that. And so the administration, Superintendent John Ryswick's administration, is going to be bringing to the school board a new proposed salary schedule to approve next month, which would then be used in setting the budget for this next year. The estimated tab of like the first year of that, if they go to this new schedule that's been recommended by the consultants, would be $39 million in new spending right out of the gate to implement it. And so, that's not the overall school system budget this year is $660 million. So if you start out by adding $39 million to that before you add anything else for the other things that they're going to need more of, or, rising equipment costs and utility costs and all the things that go up year to year, it could make the school budget, a little bit interesting, because certainly nobody is expecting that County Mayor Glenn Jacobs is going to propose a tax increase or anything this year. So whatever the school board sends him will probably be something that is within the scope of what can be accommodated under the existing county budget. So we will see. But for teachers and other school employees anyway, some potentially good news there in terms of getting yet another decent sized salary bump, which they also had this past year. And also, Scott, the Planning Commission met on Thursday, and they considered something that does not lend itself to an easy acronym. It's the Comprehensive Land Use and Transportation Plan, the CLUTP. And this is an outgrowth of the Advanced Knox project. It's we've talked about this last month because it's kind of last week, when I don't know. I don't remember when we talked about it. We've talked about it
several weeks in a row.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, this is the next step in the Advanced Knox process. It goes hand in hand with the changes to the growth policy plan, but it is a separate plan that has more detail in it than the growth policy plan does. And it was at Planning Commission on Thursday, and they spent a couple hours talking about it. Yeah,
they spent a couple of hours making some very minor tweaks to the to the plan, but essentially this plan, we have the growth policy plan, which basically divides the county up into three sections: the urban growth area, the planned growth area, which is basically suburbia, and a rural area. This plan basically goes in and says, okay, within those areas, these are the types of development that we want, either a kind of a town center thing or a traditional subdivision or park or public building like a school, things like that. So these uses are in this plan, and it's not to the level of zoning yet, but it's more detailed, and there was a lot of talk. A lot of what they talked about was kind of really kind of little detailed wording things. One of the things that's kind of could be significant is one of the reasons to do this is the general plan that they've been going by in development is more than 20 years old. It is so outdated that just about every time somebody comes to get a rezoning done, they have to also amend the general plan. And Kimberly Horn is the consultant on this, said you really ought to only have to amend the general plan once, a couple times a year. You really don't. You shouldn't be doing this.
Shouldn't be something
month.
you do. Yeah, exactly.
And
normal course of business.
So one of the things that they changed was now they have to. There's a set of criteria that they follow about whether you can amend the plan or not. There's several things that thresholds that have to be met before you can't just change the plan willy nilly. The plan initially said that you had to meet 2 of the criteria. They changed it to 1, which would make it kind of easy to change the plan if you need to. But that is those were the types of changes they ended up making. Now this plan also addresses something that comes up all the time anytime there's a rezoning in the county, especially, and this plan only affects areas that are unincorporated, not Farragut or Knoxville, but and that's the effect on roads. Almost every rezoning, the people who live in the area are opposed to it because it's a burden. The roads can't handle more development and all. One of the things is this plan also has a transportation component, and they are hoping to be able to do a better job of anticipating development, predicting where development's going to go, and making improvements either as that development's happening or before it happens. So, and this is the first time that this type of planning document has combined land use with transportation. So, it's pretty interesting there. The one other thing that made this an important vote. I mean, obviously that sounds important anyway, but the adoption of the amendments to the growth policy plan were dependent on this. That county commission had already said that. So, kind of sets up a couple of votes later this month. One is the county commission will be considering this plan, the land use and transportation plan, and
the CLET-P. I'm sticking with the CLET-P.
Yeah, I might really mangle that. I'm not going to even try that. But they're going to vote on it, and if they approve it, then the growth policy plan goes into effect. If. There's always an if these days. The town of Farragut still has to approve that, and they must approve it or it dies.
Right. And one thing we didn't mention was that City Council did approve the growth policy plan this past week as well, in addition to their other actions.
Yeah, and so and they're going to vote on the 28th for that. But assuming that Farragut approves the growth policy plan, and assuming that County Commission approves the CLET-P. Okay, I did it. Thank you. Then those plans go into effect on May 1st.
Right.
Now, there was another interesting kind of aside to that meeting and that discussion. A good chunk of those 2 hours they spent talking about these minor changes, they did talk about something that would have been a major change. And that is the hillside and ridgetop protection policy that the county has. This was developed over a decade ago. In the city, they codified it. They put it into law.
Right, and this is basically set of regulations that restricts how much development you can do on slopes above certain grades, and it's to protect hillsides and ridge tops. It's to kind of protect the beauty of the landscape, but also protect against erosion and runoff and the kinds of things you get when you heavily develop on sloped areas.
Right. And in the city, it's mandatory. You have to, if you're going to develop property in the city, you have to follow those rules. In the county, it's advisory only. It's not the law. Now, most of the time, people end up following it. And one reason is it's more expensive to develop on the hilltops, and ridge tops, and also. But there was talk among some planning commissioners about putting that into the plan, which would mean that if the county adopted that plan, they would automatically make that the law. And there was a lot of pushback on that. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of pushback on that. What they ended up doing is deciding to send a letter to county commission. They said, okay, well, we'll take it out of the plan. It won't go into the plan, but they are going to send a letter to county commission asking them to take a look at making that policy an actual requirement.
And that will certainly come up for discussion at County Commission this month when they discuss this plan, because Commissioner Kim Frazier has already said that she intends to make a motion to codify
tomato
codify the hillside plan and incorporate it as part of this. Basically, give it teeth that it doesn't have right now. Now, whether there will be majority support on commission for that or not, we will see. But that will definitely be part of their conversation.
Yeah, it was a very contentious issue. 2012, I believe it was, when it was adopted as a policy. Very contentious issue in the county, especially.
Yeah, and it's something that developers have been resistant to, and I think the reason the county made it advisory in the first place was because of pressure from, I believe, the Knoxville Chamber at the time, and also development interests. Developers in general like to have fewer restrictions rather than more, I guess, like most people. So that has been, and that will probably be the case as we have these conversations at County Commission this month. But as you mentioned, even though it is quote unquote only advisory for the county, in fact, it has ended up mostly being adopted on a project by project basis because the planning staff is still using it to make their recommendations. They refer to it all the time in both city and county projects. And more often than not, those recommendations are approved by Planning Commission and then by County Commission. And also developers, there's advantages for developers in that plan, because while it restricts what you can build on sloped areas, it does allow you it allows you greater density in the non-sloped areas. And so if you have a parcel where, a third of the parcel is sloped at a grade that brings it under the restrictions in the plan, you're restricted what you can build on that part of the property, but you get credit against that for units that can be built on the flatter parts of the property.
Right, yeah, you can cluster the development, which, that'd be obviously smaller lots, but also fewer, less road, fewer roadways.
Yep.
In there, you can
more units.
They can save more units. You can save a lot there, and I think developers kind of realize once they started working with this as a policy, kind of realize, I can have the same number of units. I can just do it on smaller lots and in a place where it's easier and cheaper to build.
Right.
And so I think that they've they've made accommodations.
But they will probably still resist.
They will still resist it because nobody wants to be. You don't want to be restricted,
right?
So.
Yeah. So we will be talking more about Hillside and Ridgetop, no doubt, in the coming weeks, because that is going to be a factor in these discussions. Okay. Well, I think there was some other stuff that happened this week too, but honestly, I think that's enough. We've talked through.
We had such a busy week that I don't know if I want to relive the whole week.
Right. I don't even remember everything that happened. So now let's set up our talk with Mike Cohen. Mike has been on our podcast before, providing expert election analysis, which is what we've tapped him for again here. For those of you not familiar with Mr. Cohen, he has been around Knoxville going on 30-some years now. He started out in media. He was a TV journalist and producer, and then ended up working in government communications for former Mayor Victor Ashe, for former County Mayor Mike Ragsdale, for the Knox County school system. He's done the
circuit.
Exactly. And that now for the last many years, he's been out on his own as a consultant, not working with political candidates, but working with especially developers, but basically people who are looking to get various kinds of projects or initiatives approved by county commission in particular. And so because of all of that, he knows an awful lot about local politics, who the players are, what it all means, and we thought it would be fun to sit down with him and talk about this week's elections. So let's go to the tape. Okay, for some further election analysis and thoughts, we are joined by Mike Cohen, who is a longtime local political observer, worked in communications at various points for the city and the county and the school system, and for the last many years has been involved as a, how do you describe yourself, Mike? You're a political communications specialist?
I describe myself as somebody that everyone should hire.
There you go.
It's interesting. I work with a lot of politicians. I have never taken a politician as a paying client because I lobby, and I wouldn't feel right lobbying somebody if I'd gotten money for them. So I help people I believe in, but I do not. I generally just represent clients and not candidates.
Right. We're talking about people who have business before our various local bodies. You kind of help shepherd them through the system. Well, so we've talked a little bit about the election here already, but just tell me your thoughts right off the top of your head. What stood out to you about these results? Did we learn anything from Tuesday?
Well, I think we learned that things are changing, but we don't know in what direction they're changing, because both the old guard traditional Republican establishment won some big races, particularly law director. They won that by a huge margin. And let's face it, I'm not making any comment about how David Book is as an attorney, but he doesn't make a great candidate. He doesn't have some of the skills that are traditionally campaign skills. But he won big. And then you look at the new guard, the more conservative arm of the Republican Party, and they won huge in the 5th district, and they won huge in the 9th district. And in the 9th district, Barry Neal, who was the more traditional candidate, had the backing of Carson Daly, the current county commissioner, who was very popular in that district. So I thought those were surprising. And I think come the fall, we are going to see some terrific races, and particularly in the 4th district, which is a very purple district. I describe that district as the hills, because it's basically Sequoia Hills, Rocky Hill, and West Hills.
Yeah.
And you've got Garrett Holt, a moderate, extremely intelligent and articulate Republican, and Shane Jackson, who's been a friend of mine for 10 years and is a banker and a former city council member, I think, from Athens. The good part about that race is the voters can't lose. Those are two outstanding candidates.
Yeah, I guess we should jump in and say, and any candidates who you've personally contributed to or are supporting in these races?
Yeah. In the upcoming races, well, I don't know. We'll see who I support in the upcoming races, but people I gave money to in the primary included Terry Hill, Corcoran, Rawls, Durrett, and Shane Jackson because he's an old friend.
Kind of a bipartisan group there. A couple of Democrats, a couple of Republicans. Well, yeah. So that fourth district race was interesting because that one you had Garrett Holt, who, as you say, I mean, he actually describes himself as a moderate, which you don't hear a lot from Republican candidates these days, but in tune with that district, certainly, arguably. And the challenge there was kind of not from that. The group, especially around Eric Wyatt, conservative consultant Eric Wyatt, or who really shepherded Angela Russell in the 5th district and Andy Fox in the 9th district. Yep. But it was against Liz Tombras, whose backing kind of came from like what used to be the West Knox Republican Club crowd, Gary Lowe and that group. And it just felt to me like they just didn't really make any impact in that district at all, did they?
No, she was just crushed. I mean, I know the people working with Garrett Holt, particularly Andrew Davis. He was worried. Of course, even if you're up by 50 points, you run like you're 20 points down. But I know Andrew was concerned about what kind of a race it was going to be. But as it turned out, I think in that district, the far right doesn't work. As I kind of said at the beginning, it's a very purple district. It could go. I won't be surprised if Holt wins. I won't be surprised if Jackson wins. I don't know. The most surprising result to me was probably the 5th district, where Angela Russell, there were 3 candidates that people were really focused on, and Angela Russell took a bigger percentage than the other 2 primary contenders combined. She beat the 2 of them together by 10 points. It's a crazy big vote.
Yeah, and a 5-person field for somebody to get almost 50% of the vote was pretty surprising. I said on this very podcast not too many weeks ago that anyone who cleared 40% in that race, that was going to be impressive, and she got almost 50. And so in that race and in the 9th district, you have these 2 candidates, and her and Andy Fox, who on the one hand, you could kind of describe them as far right candidates, or they're the Knox County conservative Republicans group, that group around Eric Wyatt.
Yeah.
But do you think is that a reflection that their ideology was so appealing and persuasive, or is it a reflection of the thing we always hear about Eric Wyatt is that he works his candidates hard and they get out there and knock on doors? So was it more those mechanics, or was it more the kind of ideological appeal?
I think it's both. I mean, it's not just ideological, because if it was, where those 2 candidates won, Daniel Herrera would have won as well, because he represented that. And he was just, people weren't tuned into it, at least not for a law director. I mean, Daniel Herrera talked a lot about immigration, which last time I checked, the Knox County law director doesn't have a freaking thing to do with it. The only person that does really is the sheriff's department, and they use their own attorney, internally. So it didn't work. So I think it's a combination of what they represent and the issues they might be dealing with. I tell you what, this is not a major thing to everybody in the public, but I've worked over the years with a lot of developers, quality developers from my point of view. So they've generally had wide support on council and commission because they're doing quality development. But it's going to be a different world for developers going forward. County commission is going to be different about developments and pilots and TIFs. And, I think I can still count a majority of things that of commissioners that you can get stuff passed, but it's going to be different. And development is going to get a lot harder look on this people, and you have some people that are going to kind of openly oppose some kinds of development, which is tough. You have a commission moving further against too much development, and you have no greater need in the community than housing.
And they're in the midst of redoing the growth plan and the zoning ordinance and everything.
Right.
And right, especially that the zoning ordinance will come through whatever this new commission is. And as you say, I mean, in the 5th district, in the 8th district, Adam Thompson, and I think Andy Fox in the 9th as well. Like those were all candidates who won primaries on messages of at least skepticism, right, toward development.
I try to console myself by saying there's some history of people coming into office and developers thinking they're going to be terrible. And they're not anti-development; they're anti-bad development or improper development. And I will give you 2 examples of that. On the city side, developers were scared to death when Seema Singh first got elected, and have found Seema very good to work with on most projects. On the county side, Kim Frazier. Developers were scared to death when Kim Frazier came in. But if you're building something good that meets a community need, she's been supportive of quality development. So hopefully these new people will also be that way and not just anti-development, period. I mean, let's remember that the amount of development we've had in Knox County is the only reason we have been able to go 20 years without a tax increase and maintain decent services, because there's lots of new revenue every year from new development paying taxes.
Yeah, one thing, you touched on it briefly when you talked about Daniel Herrera and talking about immigration a lot. That idea that these national issues are bleeding down into the local elections. How much are you seeing that as increasing? And Herrera lost. Fox was very similar, not necessarily directly about immigration, but he also talks about national issues, and he won convincingly. So how much is that a factor, do you think?
Well, the biggest factor is still just how good of a candidate you are. Although the law director's office I don't think either of them were great candidates, but and part of it becomes the national issue that you focus on. If you focus on immigration, everybody's concerned about that, but I don't know if they're going to go out and vote for a county commissioner on it. On the other hand, when they talk about COVID and the mask mandates and everything like that, I think there is more local. I want somebody that feels differently than what we went through last time to be in a position of authority this time. So I think health issue plays locally, and I'm not sure immigration is there's nobody running that's for illegal immigration. I think virtually, if not 100%, close to it, 100% of Americans are concerned we just have too many illegal immigrants coming over the southern border and we need to do something. So, you say I'm concerned and I'm going to be tough on immigration. You're not going to be running against somebody that says, oh, I think we should just take the border guards away and let them come in whenever they want. I mean, it's just not that effective.
What about the assessor's race? I think that was one that everybody I talked to was kind of surprised by, just how close it is. I mean, 12 votes out of 42,000 that's pretty unusual. Yeah. But there was also, I think, a sense that Jackie Raley, was in really strong position there. She certainly created the impression of being in strong position. She raised a lot of money, had a huge kickoff last year. She had some very prominent supporters.
Yeah.
Was that just, and I know it's an office that most people don't really think about that much. How much of Phil Ballard's support really was just that he's held the office before and people might have sort of recognized his name? And of course, he appeared first on the ballot alphabetically.
He's a proven winner. He's been elected to county commission. He's been elected to that office before. So that can go a long way. And Jackie was a first-time candidate. But the other thing on a close race like that, I'll be honest with you, I think what won that race for Phil Ballard were his TV spots. He talked about the current office took longer and cost more, and there's been more job turnover than when I was running it. And, even though he wasn't running against an incumbent, but somebody that just worked in the office. But I thought his ads were good enough and ran often enough that did they move at least 12 votes? Yeah, absolutely. Or 30 votes, or they probably moved several hundred votes. And I think it was Phil Ballard's TV ads that got him elected.
And we should say we're taping this on Thursday, so the reconciliation of the provisional ballots, which is going to happen Friday, hasn't happened yet.
Right.
So by the time we're taping the regular podcast, we'll know the exact outcome, but it is at least theoretically possible that those ballots will change that race. But yeah, Ballard's TV ads, and see, that was something that, because we have such a diffuse media environment now, I was not really even aware of his TV ads. A couple people said that to me on Tuesday night, that they had heard from people who they had talked to that, oh yeah, I see Phil Ballard's ads all over TV. A lot of us don't watch network TV on a regular basis anymore. So like there can be this whole side of these campaigns going on that's sort of invisible unless you happen to be in that environment.
Well, I think he ran some ads during local newscasts, and I haven't seen the numbers lately, but from back when I was in TV, and admittedly that was when we still had to shovel coal into the transmitter. But back when I worked in TV, people who watched local news were people who voted. They're people who are interested in what's going on and want to know what's going on in the community. Obviously now, as opposed to when I was in it, they watch it primarily for the weather. But once they get past the weather and make a little time to actually cover news, I think you get voters watching TV, so that's a good place to advertise. It's expensive, and you got to realize that you buy an ad on a local TV station on the 6 o'clock newscast. It's not going to be cheap, and on top of that, you're paying to reach 100% of their audience, 92% of which can't vote in your race.
Yeah.
So it's not an effective use of money, except it reaches.
Maybe in this case it is.
It might have got Phil Ballard the job. So
I think
our friends in local TV are going to definitely be making that point, I'm sure, to future candidates. Like, TV advertising is still a good place to spend your money.
Really, I would love to see an analysis if anybody ever does one, but I really believe TV is what won it for Phil Ballard, and he's a good candidate.
What about the school board races? We had 2 competitive primaries there, and I guess the thing that stood out to me about that was, and we've had some surprises in school board races in recent years in some ways, but in this case, kind of the candidates who had the backing of establishment Republican donors, particularly members of the Haslam family, they won both of those races in the 3rd and 8th district. And in the 8th district race, of course, Travis Wright had support from everybody. He had support from the Haslams and from Steve Hunley at the Knoxville Focus, and Tim Burchett endorsed him. And so is there anything to draw from that beyond, sometimes the old ways work?
I don't think so. School board, even though it's become partisan, which I don't personally believe is a good thing for the school board, even though it's become partisan, it's mostly people who care about education, not just want to hold an elective office, and they have, I don't think we're going to have a school board that is hell bent on getting rid of Superintendent Ryswick and changing the direction of the system. The system's making improvements. It's gaining. I think most people think John Ryswick is a sharp guy. Certainly the finest superintendent we've ever had from Mascot. So it's good. The 8th person will probably be a little more thoughtful and a little less hardline political than the late Mike McMillan was.
Scott, any other thoughts before we wrap up here?
Well, I guess so. The one thing I'd like to do is look ahead. You mentioned the 4th district being purple, and of course, if it goes to the Democrats, that'll be a gain. The first time they've gained a seat in a long time. So, and the Democrats are running in just about every race. I believe they've got somebody who's running. Some cases. How does the Democratic field match up with the Republicans that won in the primary?
It's a good question, and it's a tough one to answer because I don't think we know yet. And where the Democratic Party is today and fielding candidates for most offices, which they didn't do for a lot of years, I think that is largely because of the really effective work by Matt Shears when he ran the Democratic Party. And he's now moved with his family to where he was raised in North Carolina. And it'll be interesting to see how the Democratic Party does. But you're right. I mean, the fourth district could go Democratic. I don't think the ninth district could, but I have friends that say Matthew Park is a very good candidate, and that may come down partially to the amount of voters that are in the city in South Knoxville versus the rest of the district outside the city limits, and that could be a tough race too.
Yeah, it strikes me that Park's best avenue there is just to try to drive up turnout in those city precincts as much as possible, right? And, you have there along Sevier Avenue, I mean, there's, I don't know, several hundred at least new residents there of South Knoxville. And I agree with you that is the area that Park should probably focus a lot of attention on versus the areas outside the city, which some of those precincts go 70-80% Republican routinely.
Oh, one other one from this weekend is from this primary election is we have probably seen the political end of Evelyn Gill.
Yeah.
She served one term on county commission, then lost in the primary for re-election, which seldom happens, then ran again when Daisha Lundy decided not to run and got beat again. She carried a couple of precincts, but it was interesting. The precinct she carried, like she split West High School and she carried West View. But you get to what people think of as the heart of that district, which is East Knoxville.
Mm-hmm.
All the precincts in East Knoxville went hugely for Damon Rolls.
Yeah, he totally ran the table. And yeah, she's an interesting case because this was the third straight primary that she's been in, right? Because in 2016, she somewhat surprisingly beat Rick Staples, which is the way she got elected to that seat. But then in 2020, lost in the primary to Lundy. And as you say, this past week
But she won that first time. She won that first time because she ran a really good, smart campaign. She kind of hooked herself on national candidates and stuff too, and then she ran bad campaigns the next two times. And I would think I'd be surprised to see her run for something again and be taken seriously.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so that kind of keeps that. I mean, assuming that Rawls wins the general, which of course it's a hugely Democratic district, so that's one of the safer bets in the general election. But that kind of keeps that seat more in the, Rawls comes out of what we think of as like the more traditional East Knoxville political milieu. He had support from a lot of the major players there and from a lot of just major Democratic Party people in general. So it's Gill was more of an outlier, obviously.
I agree.
That was the only that was good of you, Mike, to bring in some talk about the Democrats here. It's the only race that the Democrats even had for anyone to talk about locally. All right, well, that seems like a good way to wrap it up. Maybe we can have you back later in the year to see what happens in the next go round.
I'd love it.
All right. Well,
all right.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
All right.
Thanks, Mike.
All right.
And thanks again to Mike for chatting with us. While we were on our break, our producer, Lord Seth Barber, here with Barbarian Productions, has reminded us, Scott, this is our 100th episode of Compass Points. We've made 100 podcasts.
Wow.
We are centennial podcasters.
That is that's really amazing, especially because I mean you dragged me kicking and screaming into the studio to do this, and now
we still have to do that every week. Actually.
Well,
it's a little embarrassing.
Well, I don't scream so much. I just kick. But it's not my natural habitat. But it's been a lot of fun. Enjoyed it. I did not realize it'd been 100 episodes, which basically means 2 years.
Yeah.
And Seth's been great as far as accommodating our crazy schedules and everything else. So it's been fantastic. We can shoot for 200.
Yeah, and thank you all for listening, too. I do have to say that I don't know about you, Scott. I get a lot of positive feedback on the podcast. When I was down at the Republican Party election night gathering Tuesday, I had a couple of different people, political people who were there, and also other members of the media tell me how much they like the podcast. So who knew that people would listen to you and me talking about anything for 100 episodes? But here we are, and we're happy to do it, and we hope that it's useful to you as you are driving or mowing your lawn or whatever you do while you listen to podcasts. I listen to podcasts at the gym. I mean, sometimes you put on music, get yourself pumped up and whatever. But there can be something sort of relaxing about just putting on a conversation and kind of getting lost in that. And, before you know it, you've done 6 miles or whatever. All right. Well, let's look ahead to this coming week. Scott, this coming week, it doesn't look like there's much going on.
Unlike last week, this week is there's not a lot going on in the civic world.
It is spring break.
Spring break for one thing. And
Knox County schools are on spring break, and the University of Tennessee is on spring break. And so this is a week that a lot of people plan to be out of town. And because of that, a lot of our local civic bodies and so forth do not schedule anything during this week. The major exception, obviously, is the state legislature, which is in the midst of kind of the busiest time of year there in Nashville. There are a couple of significant bills moving through the legislature that there could be news on next week. Certainly we will be following those. But in terms of meetings, I don't think we have any meetings to go to next week.
Yeah, it's been 5 years since I've had a week where I just didn't have any meetings to go to, it seems like. But it's almost like the week between Christmas and New Year's, right? Because we don't have meetings then either.
Well, we don't worry. We have things to write about. We do things stored up that we need to get to. So this will be an opportunity to do that, sort of in this break before, because then we come out of spring break and then we're into local budget season, and we're very quickly going to go through the school board and the city and the county presenting their budgets and going through all of that. And then by the time we get to June, we will be getting back into getting closer to the county general election, which is August 1st. And so there will be certainly some political coverage during the summer. But yeah, this will be a week to kind of catch our breath, and we hope that you all are able to maybe do that a little bit too. If you are traveling, taking any family vacations or anything, enjoy yourselves, travel safely. We
have no idea what will be in episode 101.
That's right.
But we'll be back here.
Something will happen next week, and we will be.
It won't keep us from babbling about something.
That's right. We can always babble. That's not a problem. Right. Well, we will be back to talk about anything that happens, or maybe even things that don't happen, because sometimes that's newsworthy too. In the meantime, have a good week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions. and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.